On March 11, 2021, I released a video titled 90% of Americans do not support universal background checks, HR 8. I made the video in response to US Representative Mike Thompson, who tweeted that HR 8, a universal background check bill, has bipartisan support from 90% of the American people. In my video, I stated that this is not true because the polls where Mike Thompson got this 90% number from were misleading, because they didn't ask about universal background checks, which are different from the regular background checks that we already have. I further stated that if the people who were polled understood the distinction between a background check and a universal background check, and that a universal background check can't be enforced effectively without a national gun registry, I highly doubt 90% of Americans would agree with a universal background check. 4 days after I released my video, I got an email from a guy named Tom Kertscher. According to his LinkedIn, Tom is a national freelance reporter who works primarily for Politifact. He's also a regular contributor for the New York Times, Associated Press Sports, other magazines and websites, and has 35 years as a newspaper reporter. Here's what Tom's email said. Colion, I'm doing a Politifact fact check article on this statement from your March 12th Facebook post where 90% of Americans do not support universal background checks. If you have any evidence to support the statement beyond what's in the post and the video, please send by noon Central Time today. Thank you. That same day, Politifact released an article from Tom claiming that my video was flagged as part of Facebook's effort to combat false news and misinformation on its newsfeed, and that my video was false. Sites like Politifact are designed to verify political claims and hold politicians accountable. I am not a politician, so why is Tom writing a Politifact article about my video? Could it be that Tom is rabidly anti-gun and I'm one of the more biggest Second Amendment voices in the country, and I just put out a video destroying a narrative that the gun control lobby has been pushing for decades? I guess we're about to find out. Let's get one thing clear. This was not an article to determine the truth of my argument. This was a hit piece designed to ruin my reputation and credibility with people who are in the middle when it comes to the gun debate. When Tom writes an article like this for Politifact and Tom determines that my video is false, Facebook puts up a disclaimer before you can watch the video, saying that independent fact checkers reviewed the video and said that it was partly false. They understand that many of my followers share my videos with their non-gun owning friends as a way to educate them on the 2A issue, because the mainstream media is largely anti-gun. But if you send a video to someone and the platform that the video was on puts up a disclaimer before you even watch the video saying that it's false, you're not gonna watch the video. And if you do, you're not gonna believe anything I say in the video, because Facebook artificially props up Tom as an objective authority on the issue. Tom is anything but objective on the issue. All you have to do is search guns on his Twitter feed, and the vast majority of his gun tweets are anti-gun tweets from politicians and Politifact articles that he's written to disprove gun arguments. The timestamp on when Tom sent this email was at 8:46 a.m., yet he gave me a 12 p.m. deadline to respond. At 12:50 p.m., I got a text message from a friend with a link to the article. As far as I'm concerned, Tom already had that article written before he sent the email. If Tom was really trying to be objective, as Politifact claims to be, at bare minimum, he would have given me 12 to 24 hours to respond, not less than 4 hours. But Tom had no intentions on actually being objective. He just wanted the appearance of it so that he can say in the article that he reached out to me, but I never responded to his email. And ironically enough, that's literally what he did. But neither his post nor an accompanying video provides evidence to back up his claim. He did not reply to our email. What makes it even more evident that this was a hit piece is the fact that Tom tries to dox me and then drag me through the mud with an out of context statement. Colion Noir is not my real name, and for good reason. I'm one of the most public voices on one of the most controversial issues in this country. My real name is tied to my mom's address, who lives alone, and I have a lot of people who hate me for my stance on the Second Amendment. So yes, I use an alias, and I understand that I am a public figure, but Tom tosses out my government name halfway through the article when it has nothing to do with the argument. The reality is Tom was trying to mark me. I know this because he only uses my real name in connection with my statements about the Parkland shooting that were made like 3 years ago. And I received the most backlash and hate I've ever received for a statement that was willfully and purposefully taken out of context in order to smear me. You can see how he reaches to draw a connection between my Parkland statement and the fact that 3 Republicans from Florida voted yes on H.R. 8. The House passed the bill 227 to 203 on March 11th and sent it to the Senate. Rep. Jared Golden of Maine was the only Democrat to vote no. 8 Republicans, including 3 from Florida, voted yes. Colion Noir is an alias used by Texas lawyer, he says my government name here, as a host on the National Rifle Association's TV channel. Keep in mind I haven't been with the NRA for almost 2 years now. He criticized students of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland as being un-American when they led a protest march in Washington after former student shot and killed 17 people at their school in 2018. Tom then links to a TampaBay.com article where they quote me saying, the latest attack came from Colion Noir, a host on NRA TV, who took to the airwaves on the eve of the Parkland teens-led march on Washington, telling them no one would know your names if a student gunman hadn't stormed into their school and killed the 3 staff members and 14 students. Except, this is what I actually said in the video in full context.
I acknowledge the heroism and bravery of Blaine Gaskill, the Maryland school resource officer who stopped the mass shooter in his tracks and saved the lives of every innocent kid in that school. To all the kids from Parkland getting ready to use your First Amendment to attack everyone else's Second Amendment at your march on Saturday, I wish a hero like Blaine had been at Marjorie Douglas High School last month, because your classmates would still be alive and no one would know your names, because the media would have completely and utterly ignored your story the way they ignored his.
The media purposefully and completely took my statement out of context because it was a critique of them and how they exploit tragedy and ignore tragedies that are prevented or stopped by a good guy with a gun. They wrote the article after article after article trying to demonize me for a statement that they took out of context on purpose. And now Tom, who's supposed to be an independent fact checker, is doing the exact same thing while doxing me so that people who are angry about that out of context statement can target me. Again, I ask, what does this have to do with the price of tea in China? So what if 3 Republicans from Florida voted yes? Only 52.8% of the House voted yes. You can't get 90% of 430 in the House to agree on a bill that you're claiming 90% of Americans agree. If you disagree with my position, argue your points on the merits. You don't need to put a target on my back for a blatantly out of context statement. Tom's entire argument for why my video was false is based on 2 major arguments. The first one is this. Noir argues in his post that a national gun registry would have to be established in order to enforce a universal background check, and that support for universal background checks would not be 90% if a registry were required. But neither his post nor an accompanying video provides evidence to back up his claim. He did not reply to our emails. Let's start with the first part of that argument. I've done multiple videos on universal background checks, explaining why you would need a gun registry to enforce it. But since a so-called independent fact checker can't do his own Google search to find my explanations as to why this is the case, I'll give you a different authority. How about the United States Justice Department review of violence prevention studies found that even a perfect universal background check system not address the largest source of crime guns. Furthermore, the study found that effectiveness would depend on requiring gun registration. But I want you to notice how he said I didn't provide any evidence, yet he's the one saying I'm wrong, but won't provide any evidence of his own to the contrary. But I'm not surprised because he knows this already. That's why he's trying to play the absence of evidence is the evidence of absence game. But he knows you can't enforce a universal background check without a registry. That's why he didn't answer it himself. Besides, whenever you ask any of these pro-universal background check politicians how they're going to actually effectively enforce a universal background check, they can't answer, or they refuse to answer because they know why I'm asking the question.
We should have regulations like background checks on every single gun.
Now, how would you enforce that?
Okay.
And that was someone Biden was trying to add to his cabinet, but couldn't get her confirmed because her tweets demonstrated that she couldn't be impartial. kind of like Tom in his tweets and this Politifact article. The second part of Tom's first argument states, neither my post nor an accompanying video provides evidence to back up the claim that support for universal background checks would not be 90% if a registry were required. My argument is not that these polls weren't conducted and that they didn't actually get 90% of the people that they asked to agree with background checks. The entire crux of my argument is that you only got 90% because you asked overly broad questions about background checks, and that if you had asked more specific questions about universal background checks, which is what HR 8 is about, and which I said can't be enforced without a national gun registration, I can almost assure you that you would not have got a 90% approval on the polls. And I'm going to use an anti-gun group's website to prove it. The Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence is one of the most recognized gun control groups in the country. And literally on their website, it says this. A nationwide survey conducted in January 2011 found that 66% of respondents favor laws requiring every gun owner to register each gun he or she owns as part of a national gun registry. If only 66% of people are in favor of gun registry, it's safe to say that if the 90% of the people who approved of background checks learn that you can't enforce a universal background check without a national gun registry, you wouldn't get a 90% approval. The last part of Tom's argument rests on his final conclusion. Noir claimed in a Facebook post that 90% of Americans do not support universal background checks. This contradicts numerous polls that show the opposite. The best available evidence is that support for universal background checks is at or near 90%. We rate the post false. Tom's entire argument for why my video was false is based on 19 polls that found that near 80% to 90% of Americans support universal background checks. But here's the problem. None of the polls actually use the phrase universal background checks in their question. Tom used it in his title when he concluded support for universal background checks on gun buyers is near 90%. But none of the polls actually use the phrase universal background check or explain the difference from the background checks we already have. The reason why this is important is because universal background checks do not apply to gun sales. They apply to all transfers, but none of the questions on this poll states that. So if I wanted to loan a gun to a friend, I can't loan it to him without first going to a gun store to get a background check. And after that, we have to go back to the gun store to get another background check in order for my friend to transfer the gun back to me. And let's not forget, transfers aren't free. They can cost up to $50 per transfer. That's $100 just to loan my friend a gun. So you can't state that 90% of Americans support universal background check as a fact when the polls you're using to make this claim didn't even ask about universal background checks. They only asked about private sales and gun show loopholes, which is also not true. There is no gun show loophole. If you're a dealer at a gun show, you have to conduct a background check on every sale. Not only did none of these polls ask specifically about universal background checks, this 90% number gives the false impression that these polls asked a ton of people. The first poll Tom uses asked less than 2,000 people, and only 66% strongly supported requiring background checks for all gun purchases. 18% only somewhat supported it. But of the 19 polls that Tom mentioned, none of them polled more than 2,000 people. There were some that were as low as 800 people. The only exception was the Poll Research poll that polled 9,895 people. We have over 300 million people in this country. I'm sorry. I get it's virtually impossible to poll everyone in the country, but when I hear a stat that says 90% of Americans agree on anything, I expect the poll sampling size to be much larger than 2,000 people, or bare minimum, if you're gonna choose polls with that size sample, at least choose a poll that specifically asks about universal background checks specifically, like the study conducted by Dr. Michael Siegel at Boston University that was published in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine on July of 2020. They found that when asked specifically about whether the participants supported universal background checks, only 75% of the people supported universal background checks. And this was a sample size based on over 2,086 people. It's even harder to believe this 90% number when this percentage doesn't actually show itself when universal background checks are voted on the state level. Washington State has universal background checks on the state level, but it only got 59% of the popular vote in Washington. And that's a state that hasn't elected a Republican senator since 1994 or a Republican governor since 1980. And in Nevada, it got only 50.5% of the popular vote. And in Maine, it lost with only 48% support. Long story short, during ballot initiatives, people learn way more about a proposed bill than a random poll asking vague questions. Yet, when they have more info about universal background checks, 90% of the people aren't voting for it. It's not even close. And here's the crazy thing. If you combine the number of people who actually voted on universal background checks in all of the 3 states that I just mentioned, it's close to 3.97 million people. And each of these states lean blue. And out of the 3.97 million voters in those 3 states, only 54.7% voted in favor of universal background checks. Yet you're saying my video was false because you found some polls that barely polled 2,000 people while asking vague questions about background checks and never mentioning universal background checks. I promise you that if those ballot initiatives were 90%, Tom would have led with those numbers, but he didn't even mention them. Instead, he crafted a straw man argument, making it seem like I was questioning whether the polls actually happened or they didn't get the responses that they got, when in reality, I was arguing that the people who answered those polls didn't get enough information about universal background checks to have an informed opinion. And if they had that information, those polls would not have got 90% support. If you ask me, I think it's incredibly deceitful to use polls over actual ballot initiatives and how people really voted, especially considering how unreliable polls have been proven to be since the 2016 election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. But like I said at the beginning of this video, you weren't trying to objectively weigh the truthfulness of my video. You were trying to smear me and destroy my credibility with people who don't already know my body of work, because you understand that I have a lot of crossover appeal that speaks to people on both sides of the issue in a way that is effective. And the only way to stop me is to smear me or try to hit me with enough of these fake false fact investigations to get me banned from the platform. Because of this Politifact Facebook partnership and one random claiming my video was false, now that video and any attempt to share it is hit with this disclaimer. This also means that Facebook will limit the reach of that video and ultimately could result in my page being removed from Facebook. Facebook is supposed to be a platform for open discussion. Instead, it's turning into a platform where random fact checkers get to play God. How are we supposed to have an open dialogue and exchange of ideas and opinions when the platforms where the vast majority of these conversations are happening uses a clearly biased independent fact checker to justify invalidating my video and as a result limiting its reach? I'm just trying to inform people about one of the most important, if not the most important right we have in this country. I get that Facebook is a private platform and they can do whatever they want and use whoever they want or any guy named after a pair of shoes they want, what can or cannot be posted on their platform. But have an ounce of intellectual honesty and let us have the conversation without artificially limiting our voices. That doesn't help the country, nor does it help the platform. We become stronger as a country by sharpening our ideas against the blade of open discourse. All these so-called fact checkers are nothing more than political and intellectual bullies, not because they critique my video, but because there's no one to check the fact checkers. They have the final say, and their say dictates how many people get to hear and see my ideas. And that indirectly makes them gods of online political and intellectual discourse. And as far as I'm concerned, that is insanely dangerous. Right now, there's a culture war against the Second Amendment, which is why I need your help spreading our message to counter their message. You can help do this by leaving a comment, sharing this video, and clicking the bell and subscribe button. Let my voice be your voice, and let them know you want to keep America tactical, because the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed wasn't a suggestion, it was a directive. Also, if you're wondering where to purchase your AR-15s are essential, I will not comply. I am the militia. I lost all my guns in a boating accident, and your state-specific Keep America Tactical shirt, click the link next to my head or the link in the description section. Or if you're watching this on a mobile device, tap the small triangle on the lower right-hand side of this video and click the link in the description.